Rachel, it's great to meet you, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this for our Lent reflections. You're a superintendent at Ealing Trinity Circuit, so the last 2 years will have come with a particular set of challenges. Can you tell me what lockdown has been like for you?
The first thing I remember is just how still everything got outside, but then how busy everything got inside, I think. A colleague describes the fact that in the first 2 or 3 days of lockdown, she went onto the phones and started phoning everybody in the churches. And I went on the internet and tried to work out how to do video services and how to edit them and how to connect everybody in other ways, which I think we did fairly successfully to start with. And then in terms of circuit life, the challenge all the way through has been trying to keep in contact with different groups of people. I quite often describe it as there are times when it's felt like holding 2 kilos of frozen peas without a bag. That's how the people have felt. Normally in a church, there's this sense of people being together as a community. And in lockdown, what happened was we related to each other as individuals, not as community most of the time. But then people started discovering other things as well. So worship changed. And the fact that we were doing worship on video to start with rather than on Zoom meant that people were watching it on their own, and I was worried about how people would perceive that. But I had lots of people coming to me and telling me how much it made them think about what worship was for and concentrate more on worship. And just the intimacy of worship when it's one person talking to a screen and you being that close to them, almost as close as we are now, and that sort of sense of closeness at a time when for most people there was no closeness to anybody. And a lot of people reflected with me on, the difference of that and how it made them think differently about worship and concentrate more on it rather than on the stuff that I think a lot of people concentrate on when they're in churches on Sunday, which is the church council business and, what cleaning needs done and who's on the coffee rota for that day. Suddenly those things became irrelevant. And for me, that was part of the sense of lockdown as a whole. We let go of a lot of the irrelevant stuff and began concentrating on what was essential.
And what did you miss the most during that time?
I miss the bags that contain people together, in a sense. I miss that sense of community and us all being in one place. I missed being physically with people some of the time. Though I have to admit I'm an introvert, and so some of that was a great joy as well. It's quite lovely to be able to be on my own for long tracts of time. And now I'm remembering that my church people may see this and may think, oh, crumbs. So I did miss seeing people and being with people physically. I missed singing in groups an awful lot, because for me singing is one of the things that most expresses our community, and singing on our own is not the same. And personally, one of the things I do in my free time is dance. And I do the kind of dance that you'd see on Pride and Prejudice, that kind of historical dance, which is all about the weight that the other person gives you and the way that you move together. And I did discover that you can do Regency balls online, on Zoom. It's a very weird experience dancing with other people when you're all on little screens, but you don't get that give and take from the other person, and I miss that a lot.
I think you've touched upon this when you mentioned being an introvert. I wonder what you have gained during these times.
One of the big gains was space and rhythm. Life as a minister, life in this world and in London can be done at high speed most of the time, and we barely get time to stop and to develop rhythm. And certainly I find that my life doesn't have regularity. And lockdown gave that sense of rhythm. It gave regular stopping points for different things. It gave regular time to think and to be still. So I gained that. I also gained space to be creative and permission to be creative in new ways, because when you're not communicating with people in a church building, you have to find new ways to communicate. So recording video services for me was a great joy because it gave me ways to think about new ways of doing things, and a reason to do that. And one of the things I did during one of the Holy Weeks was to decide madly to create a painting a day, to look at the readings of Mark's Gospel through the Holy Week passage and see how they inspired me, and connect with them and with what was going on in the world around. And that was a great joy.
And were there times where God felt absent, but looking back you can see those footprints in the sand?
I don't know about God feeling absent. One of the passages of scripture I used in everything that I wrote to people was that bit from Romans that says that nothing can separate us from God's love. So I never felt that God was absent. There were periods of huge lament and huge grief. One of those was painting the painting I did for Palm Sunday. And when I read the Palm Sunday reading, what was going on in the world around was protests in Myanmar that have become huge bloodshed in the year that's followed, and was already horrific at that point. There were Black Lives Matter protests in this country, the environmental protests around the world, and I began to connect to all of those. And in the painting, what I was doing was taking images from the news of real people and putting them into that story of God protesting, in a sense, about the way the world is and about the way people are harmed by others. And the way the structures and the way we live harms each other and the world around us. And that gave me a huge sense of lament, but of God's presence within it rather than God's absence. I think probably because I'm an introvert, God is always more present with me at times of quiet and when there aren't others around, in some senses, than when I feel others around. So I didn't have that sense of absence. In some ways, there's been a higher sense of struggle in reopening and in different forms of pressure coming back, and that sense of rhythm decreasing than there were during the lockdown.
And picking up on that, what has the reconnection been like for you?
It's been really tough, I think. I get a strong sense in churches of wanting to keep what they found in lockdown, but also wanting to take back all the stuff that they were doing before, with fewer and fewer people to do it, because more and more people have discovered that this isn't what they want to do anymore, or that they're tired, or that the burdens feel too great. And many of us during the end of lockdown were talking a lot about the possibilities that it offered to rethink what we were like. But in fact, the emotional and psychological effect of the lockdown has been that people have wanted to go back to normal, to not rethink, to not discover new ways, but to find the familiar, because that's what gives ground and foundation and solidity when it's felt for 2 years as if the world's been moving around them and there hasn't been any of that. And that feels like a sadness and a loss, not to be able to do some of that rethinking. But I'm wondering if that will come a year or so down the line when people begin to want to let go of the burdens and to rethink a bit more. Coming back has in some ways been tougher, even though there have been the joys of seeing people again and all of those sorts, and being able to sing together, although, behind masks. The here and not yet is uncomfortable.
Yes,
I think.
absolutely.
For everybody. And places extra burdens on church and church organisation, as well as on people's hearts and souls and everything else.
And thinking about how we are a Good Friday people, where do you see the cross in all of this?
It's interesting. When I set myself to do a picture a day, the one that didn't get finished is in fact the one that's behind me. It's the one that should have had a cross in the middle of it. The cross that should have been in the middle of it was, I was going to do two pieces, almost identical. One that had that background and was slit open with shards of glass coming out of it to be the Good Friday cross. And the other one identical, but with those shards of glass having been through the kiln, so they melted down to create Resurrection cross. And I find it interesting that those were the two pictures that I couldn't face finishing, and still haven't. And we're heading towards another Good Friday, and I'm still wondering whether they will ever get finished. I think I struggle with the idea of seeing the cross in the middle of this in a way that I don't struggle with the idea of seeing Good Friday or Maundy Thursday or any of the other parts of that Holy Week story in the middle of this. I'm not sure I see it in our experience. I see it in the experience in recent times of the mother in Afghanistan who's had to sell organs and her daughter to enable her to buy food for the other children. I see it in the mother in Myanmar who begged for her son to come out to be released, only to find his body floating in a river. I see it in those situations. And I suppose in some senses I see it reflected in the ways that people have given sacrificially. But I would see that more in other parts of the Holy Week story. So I found myself connecting with hands that gave in Holy Week. Jesus breaking bread, but also the widow who gave all she had. The woman who gave all she had in spilling oil onto Jesus' feet. And that's the image that connected with me with what everybody was going through as well. That idea of so many hands giving what they could. So yeah, I don't have an easy answer to where the cross is in this. But I do have a sense of the last 2 years bringing us closer to a recognition that death is part of life, which is something that in our society we try to avoid remembering and realising. And those initial struggles to determine that this couldn't possibly be happening here. People couldn't possibly be going into hospital and having been perfectly healthy the week before, and then ending up in a coma and dying. Those ideas that felt like disordered society rather than natural. Yeah. So death and life, yes. Crucifixion, I'm not so sure. It feels a bigger image, or a different image of life and death than the one we experienced. And that's not denying the huge suffering of so many people.
And where do you see the resurrection hope?
The both small and big answer was that, particularly in the first lockdown, it came in the signs of spring. It came at the point when, in the last 2 years, it's felt as if time wasn't working normally. At times where time has stretched or contracted, looking out at the garden and noticing that actually time was going on. Normally, it was my perception that was different, and seeing that life was coming and going. I remember very early on in the first lockdown, we just set up a WhatsApp group for prayers around the circuit. And on a Sunday night, when everybody was lighting candles, I watched a discussion take place on it and stayed out of it, where somebody who had just discovered how to use WhatsApp was teaching somebody else why they couldn't use it and what was going wrong. And that's been repeated over and over again as people have discovered new ways of connecting and new ways of showing their faith, and have taught each other and found fresh inspiration and fresh ways of being. And there's resurrection in that. Not resurrection, but where do I see God's love? In some of the members of our churches who are working in the national health or the care system, who even now are struggling. We have one of the NHS nurse managers in one of our congregations, and I know the hours she works just to find enough people to go on wards. And that's God's love, resurrection or not.
Yeah.
That's the abundance of God's love poured out in somebody. Somebody on a computer looking at rosters.
Yeah.
It's the little things that give us resurrection, I think, quite often, not the big miracles.
Absolutely agree.
Mm.
It's love breaking through in small moments and small actions.
Yeah. Somebody forwarded a poem this week that talked about seeing God in the person who smiles at you as they walk along the street, or the person who hands you something in a shop, or, you know, just the stupid little things we take for granted. Those are the big signs of new life, always.
Rachel, I'm so grateful to you for taking time to talk with me today. And thank you so much for all that you've shared.
Thank you.